thing a cow appreciates on a cold, frosty morning. That's a very warm hand.
Thank you, Dean. Dean, thank you. I was asked to introduce Burl Payne. He has a PhD in psychology and a master's degree in physics. And I said, Burl, give me something, to tell the audience. He said, well, I'm the inventor of the granola bar. Well, now you know. The other thing is, like many of our speakers, he too has had an experience in jail. He was in Thailand. He got to know the people real good. And how he got out was through meditation. He wrote 2 books on body magnetic and biomeditation. He has been instrumental in inventing the first biofeedback machines. I give you Burl Payne. Thank you.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here and to share some of my work with people who have the openness to really enjoy it. Because for me, I say enjoy because it's a kind of play that I do. I like to play, and I like to play with ideas, and nothing is more exciting to me than a new idea. And I'm going to show you some of my new ideas, and I have one of my products here. This is a pulsed magnetic field device, which came from the demonstration I'm going to show you. It's this small. I'll bet you can hear it. No, I don't hear it. It purrs a little bit. It's a very soft sound. And I just thought I'd wear it because it's so easy to wear around. And you can put it on your chest to pick your energy up, or you can stimulate your pituitary gland, or down there between your legs if you want that energy, or on your back or whatever. But I'm not going to talk about that anymore. I really want to share my other discoveries. And maybe I won't wear this after Al's talk. If I start to have green smoke around me or disappear, pull the plug. Don't use an axe to turn it off. If I can untangle between all the ropes and gadgets and things I have here. Maybe anybody has an acre of pain, they should have this. You do? Put it on a sore spot. Blue side, red side. And what I want to share with you principally in this time that we have is the exciting discovery I made, which at the time I made was... One more, okay. Was something that came from trying to figure out if I could measure something related to pyramid energy. It was an accidental discovery, like so many things that scientists do. I wasn't looking for this. I was looking for, well, are pyramids really real? Do they have an effect? And I didn't find that. Instead, I found something else. And like so many kinds of discoveries, I didn't even recognize that it was important for a while. It was probably a couple years before I really recognized that, okay, this is something new. Now, this is simple, and I'd like a volunteer. Doesn't hurt. All right, come on up here. What I'd like you to do is come over to the piano area and move slowly. Like David, okay. And see the spiral over here. And there's a chair. Duck your head, sit in it without touching the spiral. Move very slowly, much slower than you're moving. That's right. And now, if I could have some of the lights out, probably all of them. Definitely those. Now we should see on the wall. Let's see, there we are. See some of those little spots there? Okay, you didn't touch that, did you? Okay, See, it's rotating. Oh, this man's charged up. It's rotating as he's sitting in it from the top to his right. Is that correct, David? Okay. Can you tell out there in the audience? Yes. Okay. This is just nothing but what you see there. There's no tricks, no electricity. And this is what I've observed. The first ones I used were pyramids hanging with magnets on the corners. And I found that when you put your head in it or your hands around it, they will rotate a little bit. Now this is hanging from a nylon filament. So it will rotate and it will wind up until the tension gets great enough, and then it will come back. Has it started to come back yet? Still going around. It's starting to come back. Okay. Back and forth. It'll go now for a while. Now, I made, the first ones were in bottles, hanging pyramid frame, and you went up to it and put your hand around it or stood near it and it would rotate a bit. And when I first made it, I didn't know what was going on. I thought it was psychokinesis. But I kept notes. I put a little scale on the glass bottle, and I made little marks in a notebook every day of how much it moved. And gradually I began to understand things about it. When I had this sitting there, one time I was teaching a meditation class, and somebody said, "Oh, that always moves when we have this meditation class." And somebody else said, "Oh, it ever moves whenever there's a truck going by." Well, I lived on a busy street then, but it wasn't trucks because it was sitting on the fireplace mantle, a very stable, very old house, well built. And a truck, if it did anything, which it didn't, would only make it jiggle. It did not make it rotate. People made it rotate. Little kids made it move more. A couple of healers came by, one man from Russia, and they could just point their hands at it and make it move. And the kids. I found when people were ill, this effect was much smaller. When people were meditating in it, it would quiet down. Now, what's happening there now with it, David? Going the other way. Well, it will go back and forth now. By using a mirror there, which you see, and a scale on the wall, I could get numbers. So I could actually say, okay, this person's energy was such and such, and this person's is something else. Okay, I'm going to disconnect. Oh, first I want to, okay, the mirror's sideways to me, so it won't show there. But with a mirror, of course, there are these spots like the little ones now. With a scale, I could make it go, I could get actual numbers there all the time and write it down. And that's what I did over and over, maybe 1,000 times. Well, thank you, David. If I could have some lights now, I can continue. If you move very carefully out of there, maybe at the end of the hour or during the week, any of you can come up and try that when there's odd time, recess, or dinner time, and just see how your field is. What's happening with the projector? It's ready. Wonderful. Okay, here we are. Spiral galaxy, okay. This is the sun with the spiral. It's just a drawing of energy coming out from the sun. It comes out in a spiral because the sun rotates. But what I wanted to show was, that's the one in the bottle. Now, when I first made this back in '79, I thought it was for psychokinesis. I thought that, oh, I have a little tool here that people can learn better how to use this property of psychokinesis. And that led me to do an experiment involving 1 million people approximately in psychokinesis. And here was the experiment. A space station called Skylab was floating around the Earth at that time, and it was about to crash. It was slowly descending in its orbit. They couldn't get up there to change it, do anything about it. 83 tons. If it crashed in a city or populated area, it could cause a lot of damage. So I proposed that people could possibly try their PK abilities out all together. I wanted to see if there was a group effect on PK. So I got a radio station in Florida interested, and they organized all around the country radio stations to network together at the time of the meditation that we had set. And we had newspaper coverage, radio coverage beforehand, and all kinds of formal and informal ways to get the word out. Some of you may have even participated in that experiment. Anybody remember that? When the space station crashed? 79, May 79. Well, I'll come back to that in a minute, but I wanted to show you some other variations of this. These are little, as I call them sometimes, fairy rings. They're rings with magnets, plastic, and I put the magnets on in different ways, and I made measurements on them to see how they would operate. Here's another one. That's copper windings, looking out where my lab was, looking towards Cape Cod. And there's another one. Here's someone in that where I could make a measurement. I could apply various currents to the copper coil here. Nobody disappeared, but I had a purpose in mind in doing that, which I'll talk about in a minute. Here's one made of paper. That worked too, and behind it is the other one with copper windings. Okay, here we are now. This relates to the experiment on psychokinesis. At the time of the experiment, which was aired over about 40 radio stations, I asked people to ask the sun to take care of the space station. Now, why did I do that? Well, the truth is that before this experiment was about to happen on the radio, and while it was being organized, I was thinking, well, what am I going to tell people to do on this date? And I went out one day and sat under a tree and meditated, and a little voice in my head said, ask people to ask the sun to take care of it. So I followed those instructions, not understanding it. This data was taken, was graphed 2 years later. And what I found is that the sun's activity decreased the day after the meditation. That caused the particles from the sun that bombard the earth constantly to slow down a bit. There were less of them. That in turn resulted in the air of the earth diminishing a little bit. It was less agitated, so it contracted a bit. That meant that the space station had less air molecules to bump into, so it coasted farther in its orbit than it would have ordinarily. But at the time that the experiment was done, I thought it was a failure because nothing happened. And I just left it. And then NASA reported that the space station was going to stay up longer than they expected because of a change in the sun's activity. But I still didn't connect it. I didn't realize what was going on until 2 years. And I'll come back and tie this in with my work later. Okay, here's another one. This is the one I used to get a lot of my data from that I'll show. There are little ring magnets on this pyramid frame, and the scale on the wall you can see, and the little orange thing is a mirror, and I had a light fixed on the wall, similar to here, and so I could make these measurements. I used to watch the little spot on the scale with binoculars from across a very large room to see if it would move when nobody was in it. It did not. Although overnight I'd come back and I'd find that it would move maybe an inch now and then due to, I don't know, humidity changes or something. Okay, this is some data I took showing measurements I made over about a 40-hour period, 80 hours, and measurements of the Earth's magnetic field. I found somewhere along in there that this device, which I call the biofield meter, which measures our field, varied with the activity of the sun and with the Earth's magnetic field. Now, this was an astounding and lucky discovery. If it hadn't been that astronomy was a hobby of mine, I never would have noticed this. But one day, Astronomy magazine, which I took, said, big solar flare 2 months ago. And I went back to my notes, and my little pyramids in the bottle were moving as much as a quarter turn. And I thought, interesting. Why is going on? And so I started getting data from the government on the sun's activity. It comes out every week. It's available to anybody. And keeping track of it. And I found that the energy field around the body, our aura, is not magnetic, but it varies with the magnetic activity of this planet, which varies a lot. Earth's magnetic field is constantly varying. It's like the surface of the sea with big waves and little waves and ripples and froth and tidal currents, always changing. And very important for humans. So this shows just that there's a connection roughly. Okay, this is over 40 days, showing again, one curve is the Earth's magnetic field data from the government, and the other is my device, which shows an approximate connection. Now, since we have our own energy input to this, we're not totally dependent upon what happens on the planet. But the significance of this is profound. It means that every one of you is in some resonance with the whole planet's field. And this is the kind of data that shows it. And the whole planet's field is in resonance with the sun's activity, and as I found in later years, with the position of the planets and with the position of the moon. So I began working on aspects of astrology, showing that the basis for astrology, in part, is magnetic. Here is a drawing of the sun, the Earth, with a magnetic field pattern around it. That's cut off, of course, but that's only part of it. And here's another one. Because Earth has its own magnetic field, like we have our own biofields, it has its energy, and it is very much affected by the sun, which sends particles out and modifies the Earth's field. When the sun erupts with a solar flare, as it did around the 1st and 2nd of August, a lot of particles would normally hit the Earth, but they're shunted off by the Earth's magnetic field. But in the process of doing that, they jiggle the Earth's field. That jiggles our field. And I found that when our field is severely jiggled, in fact, my biofield meter will change the initial direction of rotation. In other words, our field reverses polarity at the time of the new moon, the full moon, and when there are magnetic storms. You know, people are said to get nutty sometimes around the full moon. Well, their field reverses temporarily. And I've seen this in 85% of the time in 2 years of looking at the data. It probably happened the other times I just didn't notice. Here's a pebble on the beach that I took one day as a kind of nice little analog of the Earth, and I put a little moon pebble by it, you see there, to see how that would interact. Didn't show much, but the sun, this is a wave that's sliding down the beach, in this case going up in the picture. And that's kind of like the Earth in space with the stuff from the sun coming out, making this big wave behind the Earth called the magnetic tail. The moon takes 4 days to pass through the Earth's magnetic tail. So around the time of the full moon, plus or minus 2 days, is the time when there are effects from the moon on the Earth's magnetic field. They're not always the same. It depends on what else is going on in the solar system. Here's a picture, one of the first pictures of a satellite from space that shows the Aurora Borealis. That the ring of light there, because the particles coming from the sun have so much energy, they're mostly electrons and protons, that they ionize the upper atmosphere, creating light. There's a picture from the very space station, ironically, that I tried the experiment to save. That's of the sun. You might say that's the sun's aura. The black disk in the center is something that they put up to perfectly blot out the sun so they can just take the sun's aura. And a computer is used to give the colors their intensity levels, really. And this is another picture taken in ultraviolet, I believe, of what they call a coronal hole. An island might be more appropriate, of the sun. Sun's a fascinating object. And on it you can see some little white spots. The sun has what they call bright points, visible in X-ray, very bright points of X-ray light that come and go within an hour, all over the sun. Nobody understands this. Here's a picture taken again with a filter, in this case a hydrogen alpha filter as it's called, showing a giant solar flare. That tongue of flame is so big it would just lick the Earth like nothing. The Earth would be just a little dot in that speck if it were right there. Okay, here is something I uncovered. All this work, including these instruments that I showed you and that someone has here, they came from this accidental discovery of looking into pyramid energy. This is kind of how science works, unraveling things. Well, I was looking into all kinds of material trying to find out how come this worked. And I came upon the work of Wheeler and Dewey on solar cycles and wars. And this is the sun's cycle, approximately 11 years, been observed for 200 years. And this is what happens to people when the sun erupts. This is tuberculosis, number of deaths from tuberculosis, and the center peak is when there are solar flares, and the two peaks on the side are days before and after. This is another one of blood disease, I think it is, accidents. And here's one on white blood cell activity related to a blood cell disease. Solar activity greatly affects us. Nobody has understood the mechanism until the last few years, because we didn't know that the sun was affecting the Earth's magnetic field, and the magnetic field affects our body chemistry. Now this is becoming more well known. It may not be known to you. It wasn't to me, so I'm happy to share it with you so you understand you're not always responsible for the ailments that happen to you, including the psychological ones. Now, does this go against the idea presented earlier that we create our own reality? Well, keep listening. Okay, this is the sun's activity connected with, or plotted on the same plot, as the time when wars begin. It's called cycles of peace here, peace index. I took the data on wars, really battles is the proper term, and I flipped it upside down and called it the peace index, because I realized that people are mostly peaceful. Sometimes they start fighting. Like people are mostly healthy. Sometimes they get ill. And when I did this, I was able to make a correlation that nobody had made before, but people had suspected, that the sun was somehow triggering, among all the ailments and stuff, warring behavior. I call it a new kind of disease, wars. And here's that an abstract of the curves you just saw, where the black bars are the sunspot peaks, and the white bars are when international battles start. Some of them are listed on there. There are many, many battles happening all over the world. Wheeler had 200 people studying world history for 2,500 years data he looked at, and he found this approximately 11-year cycles. By looking at the data this way and looking at the onset, I was able to get a correlation showing that this could not be happening by chance less than 8 times in 10,000. In other words, overridingly powerful is the sun in determining whether or not people fight. Mostly males. I call it analogous to PMS, for premenstrual cycle in women, maybe related to the moon. MMS. Guess what that stands for? Louder. Male. What? Male macho syndrome. MMS. Okay. Okay, so I started sharing this work back in the early 80s when I first came upon it. And here's some more of it. These are individual magnetic storms of the Earth, data from the government, and things you probably can't read, but they're things like the Falkland Islands War started, Mount St. Helens erupted, another mountain erupted, Israel marching into Lebanon, biggest sunspot activity in 25 years, riots, thousands of people killed, and this and that thing. Whenever I look at this, I find that when there are huge world events, there are magnetic storms or solar flares happening. Sometimes there are solar flares, a magnetic storm, and nothing happens. But I haven't found times when something really large has happened and there aren't magnetic storms. Magnetic storms, as they're called, disturbances to the field, have different characters. Some affect the weather, some affect people, some affect probably other things in different psychological ways that are positive, like creativity. Okay, here's Libya. This is sunspot activity. This first little peak here on the left is when U.S. and Libya had a confrontation in the Gulf of Sidra. The other one at the other end is when the U.S. bombed Libya. And then the far peak on the right is the Chernobyl accident and also a weather factor related to the planet Pluto, which I've noticed for now 10 years in a row, that when the Earth is near Pluto, solar activity may be high and the weather often turns abnormally cold. 55 U.S. cities reported record low temperatures. That was in April when that happened. There was a lunar eclipse amplifying the effect. Okay, what does all this data mean? Well, perhaps I could have a little lights now and I'll leave that slide on a bit. What I began doing when I talked about this back in '82 is I realized I was going to have to stop playing. That the war business was really getting to be a nuisance, and people were going to wreck my laboratory, and I wouldn't be able to play anymore. I lived on the beach and windsurfed every day and so forth. And no more. I got to come out of my ivory tower because it wasn't going to work. So I founded the Academy for Peace Research, and I started working on peace things. Nothing worked, really. The idea for people to hold hands across the country, that was generated in my living room back in '83. And other things we tried to do, nothing. However, when I started talking about the sun's activity and so forth, well, there's a lot of disbelief on that, but I have all the data to back that up, sideways to Sunday. So I could, anybody that was really willing to listen, I could say, okay, these are the facts, this is the facts, what more do you want for proof? I've got it, here are papers, blah, blah, blah. Examine your own life. When was the last time you had a fight with your wife? Well, here it is, there was a magnetic storm that day, and so forth. On and on and on. This repeats endlessly. People said to me, well, what if humans affect the sun? I said, I don't believe that. Completely. Please. But I'm an open-minded scientist. So I said, okay, let's do an experiment. I like things that I can get numbers on and things that everyone can understand and duplicate. So we organized an experiment, like the Psychokinesis Experiment. That was my experiment. Okay. And the experiment was to see if people meditating on peace and so forth could affect the sun's activity, which would quiet the magnetic field, which would calm down the macho males, even though they weren't meditating. See? Okay, so we wrote to all the peace groups and everybody around there, and we explained the experiment. I talked to a lot of the spiritual gurus traveling around, and other organizations helped spread the word. And over a few years, it was a 3.5-year study ending in June '88. We started this experiment. By the third time, the sun's activity was dipping every time. By the time I'd analyzed 3 pieces of data, there it was, a big dip in solar activity. Incredible. I couldn't believe it. And yet, back in '79, I had done that experiment on Skylab and showed that. Well, that was about the time I got around to plotting that data. I said, look at this. unknown to me, I had done a pilot study in '79 on the sun. Someone said, read this book by Edgar Cayce, and in there was a little statement that said, the sun's activity is a function of human behavior. Well, I read that years ago, but I didn't, poo-poo. I didn't believe that. I probably didn't exactly disbelieve it, I just had no way to interact with that. Okay, this slide, whoops, I got to back up here, is the results of 11 times of that. And this is an average of the solar activity. If it were an average of 100 times, it would be about a straight line across there. But 11 times, there's lots of variation. But look what happened. There's an arrow in the middle, shows the day of the meditation, 11 of them. The day after, which is typically the case, the solar activity always got lower. 11 times. I haven't plotted some of the data for some of the others, but I have one other here. And then it takes a little bounce and it stayed down an average of 2 weeks for 30%. Incredible. Right up here in Boulder, Colorado, they published that data. And in one of the times here that of the planned meditation, there were 6 times a year that we'd ask people to participate. Some of you here in the audience may have participated in those times. I was in Boulder, and I went around and I personally led 3 groups who were doing meditations at that time, guided them in meditations on the sun. Plus people were doing it all over. Up to a million people, maybe 3 million people participated around the world at these times. And then I was at the National Bureau of Standards the next day, and they showed me on the computer-generated video screens and so on there, the actual sun's activity as they were plotting it in real time. A little green line is going down for the sun's activity. I was really excited. I said, wow. I didn't tell them what I was doing. I said, look at that, it's going down. Yeah, it's going down today. We don't know why, it just does that. Which it does, it goes up and down all the time. But for it to go down the day after the meditation consistently, time after time, is incredible. So in this sense too, see, I was testing whether or not we create our reality. That was really part of my hypothesis here in doing this experiment. Do we affect our reality to the extent of affecting the sun? Well, that's a pretty tall order, and the implications of this experiment are incredible, if you really think about it, because I have other research, a lot of it on the weather and the sun. And think of the power we have. The key is getting together, focusing together. One person working by themselves or thousands of groups, uncoordinated, doesn't work. But when enough people use their spiritual powers, it's incredible what can be done. Now, probably few of you know that the energy, just the raw energy that we generate per pound is 2,000 to 10,000 times greater than the sun. Did you get that sleeping back there? Even when you're dozing off. 2,000 times greater than the sun's output per pound. Now the sun's a little heavier, right? So it's a little more energy altogether. But there are quite a few people now on the earth. And when you're hopping around and agitated, it gets up there 5,000 to 10,000 times the energy of the sun. The field around the body that I'm measuring with the biofield meter, as I call it, is 100 million times greater than the body's magnetic field. If it were magnetic, it would be a field equivalent to 100 times the field of the Earth at a distance from the body, locally, I mean. Of course, the Earth is large. The Earth has a small magnetic field. But our field, I'm saying, is maybe 100 to 200 times larger than the Earth's field locally. Now, who knows about our, let's say, spiritual energy, for want of a better term. So that experiment came from this little gadget that's so simple, you can make it out of tinker toys, and people have. I gave a talk to some scientists in Hawaii. I said, you can make my device out of tinker toys. Somebody went off and did it? I said, yes, sir. I have one more piece of data on this. And I need the lights for this because I don't have a slide of it. The last time we did this was June '88, the time that I had predicted back in '82 would be the worst time for the planet Earth, most likely time when World War would start. And if you can see it, it's similar to the other curve. It's very similar, but it was only one time. The other was an average of 11. And this is not included in the average of 11 because the solar activity is much higher then, and it wouldn't be right to put it in the same graph. But anyway, there it is, same curve. There were probably more peace meditations that time than ever, because besides me getting stuff from my higher self or whatever to do this work, other people were also getting this, like John Price organized the December 31st meditations, and people everywhere independently. Some woman called me from LA, said that she had contacted an ET when she was down at Joshua Tree, and the ET said, organize a peace meditation. And somebody had given her a sheet of paper of mine like this that said, organize peace meditations on these dates. So she did on that date, and she did a big thing in LA, and somebody wrote me, just by chance, from the East Coast, said, I'm sending out 2,000 flyers to people to meditate on this day, same day that we picked for the peace meditation. There were 6 planets lined up with the galactic center on that day. Very rare event. In fact, so rare that I was able to calculate after some months of puzzlement that it last happened 9,240 years ago. The last time these planets lined up like that. So anyway.
When's your next one?
Well, I stopped at that point. Meditations are still happening, but I stopped doing the formal experiment because I'd set a time back in '82, said we'll do it till then, we'll stop. And international relationships greatly improved, and so I'm able to go back to playing again. And so now I've been able to go back to do, my work is physics and science and stuff. And so I've been working on unifying physics and putting aliveness into the equations. And here's what I've come up with. Working in a unified field theory, just steps towards it, but it's so simple that I can explain it to you, no equations necessary. I noticed after many, many experiments that the field around the body seems to be what I could call a spin field. That is, these things always spin. They don't go back and forth. They don't go up and down, or at least, of course, I couldn't tell with this apparatus, but they seem to go always spin, usually in this direction. A lot of people have talked about a field around the body that seems to be a spin field. And torque is the proper word for scientists, but then I realized something that all of you probably know, that everywhere in the universe things are spinning. The galaxy, that final slide, you can put that on there, the tiniest particles that the physicists talk about, electrons, protons, even photons, have spin. Galaxy, you've all seen these beautiful spiral galaxies. All the planets spin, the satellites spin, and most of them spin in one direction, almost all of them. And some astronomers said the whole universe must have spin. So from the tiniest particle to the greatest particles that we can see, a galaxy, spin is a common property. So I thought, okay, here it is right in front of us. Everything spins. We ought to allow spin to be considered a fundamental force. And then we have gravity, and everyone's always saying, well, what about anti-gravity and so on? Well, spin is a natural complement to gravity. It keeps things rotating around it. If it weren't for something like a spin force, things would eventually clump together, and there would be a big bang. but that's only speculation, but the Big Bang idea. But the spin thing is observed everywhere. I measured plants, couple, a grapefruit, a watermelon, and I suspect that there is a spin force or torque around all living things, and that it's probably much larger around living organisms than, say, around planets, inert objects. Well, some people could say they're living too. Then, poking into magnetism and making these magnetic instruments, I realized that magnetism is a word that we ought to replace with the word spin. Magnetism, if you look very close at it, seems to be a spin or maybe a spiral around a wire. And Mark Roden talked about spirals being fundamental. I made a big coil with looking at the toroid in the center like he was talking about and so forth as part of my research. I didn't bring it. But all this stuff, spin, spirals, spiral helix, magnetism related to electricity, so I'm able to put it together just by introducing this one other force in physics and to do what I wanted to do years ago, to bring the something like aliveness into physics and say, okay, I can talk about the spin force around biological systems. And that will help physics move out of what it's been doing, which is, well, I used to say, physicists only study shadows of reality. So I've written some of this in this book and more, a lot, about $100,000 worth of research in this book, and I have some back here. You might find it interesting, and I invite you to make your own versions of my instruments and play with them and do experiments and test things out. I always like people to test things. I used to test my friends. I remember I had those big pyramid frames. Well, I wanted to verify whether or not I could make magnetic fields that would get people nutty. So I'd have my friends stick their heads in there and I'd put the juice on and see if they felt like hitting me or something. Instead, I found the fields that heal. I'm a natural optimist anyway, see. And so I found, someone else found the field that upset people, a guy in Spain, but I found the one that healed, and that eventually evolved into the little instruments that I showed you in the beginning. So I have a few minutes, and I'd be delighted to answer questions. Yes?
Yeah, you presented first the idea that the solar flares and all from the sun affect human beings, and then you present that human beings affect it, and the war correlates to the solar flares. Do you suppose it might be the grand anomaly in human consciousness that creates the war and also creates the flare rather than the sun?
Okay, the question asked was, maybe, if I may rephrase it, tell me if I'm right, that maybe humans first create the solar flares and the wars more or less simultaneously, which in turn feeds back. Okay. If that were so, wars wouldn't show the irregular pattern. Battles is the right term, not wars. Would not show the regularity that Wheeler found of 11-year cycle. He found that was so regular, only 3 times in 2,500 years did people miss. However, to add to your question a bit, after the earthquake in California last October, 36 hours later, in fact, there was a huge solar flare, one of the largest since August 72. Now, I live in Santa Cruz, 10 miles from the center, and I was kind of busy at the time dealing with survival things, camping in the backyard and so forth, getting water from the stream. So I wasn't paying attention. But a few days later, when I got the data from the government, oh, look at that, a big solar flare. And I thought, well, here's a case, although I only have one data point, where the TV amplified that earthquake way larger than it was physically. The psychological effect on people was greatly amplified by TV, and probably the farther away from Santa Cruz and San Francisco, the greater was the perceived disturbance. And so there were millions of people very agitated. 36 hours later, and I already noticed delays in the sun, came the sun's response. So yes and no is the answer to your question. I would say that we are in a big feedback loop with the sun. And the implications of this, I mean, I'm still thinking about it. It really is boggling.
Why couldn't the 11-year cycle be in human consciousness rather than the sun?
Okay, the question asks us, why couldn't the 11-year cycle be in human consciousness rather than the sun? I don't have an answer to that question. It could be, but the sun does seem to have its own intrinsic rhythm. We'll just leave that question there for someone else to answer, and I'll answer some more questions here.
Have you been at all following the fact that the Earth's natural resonant frequency of near 8 cycles has disappeared in the last few months?
No, I don't have any data on that. Oh, the question was, have I been following the fact that the Earth's natural frequency of about 8 cycles, 7.8, has changed, disappeared.
It started when the Soviets started their emissions, it started decreasing, and then the Soviets and Americans went together, it got worse, and then they both stopped, and now there's nothing left.
I'm not aware of that data. I haven't seen that in the government reports. That frequency of the Earth is merely the Earth's circumference divided into the speed of light. So I'm not sure it's that meaningful a physical parameter.
Well, it is a biological term of reference for everything that lived since at least the last 10,000 years, and now it's disappeared. I just wondered what it involved.
I haven't heard that it disappeared. So.
Secondary question, have you ever thought about the possibility that what has happened in many countries, starting with East Europe and so on, is a consequence of the buildup of the largest solar flare activity ever in human history?
Yes, I plot that all the time, and I send out a newsletter every month. He asked about the changes in Europe and so forth, and relation to solar flares. And every month I send out the predictions of the solar activity, sometimes predictions on the weather when it's going to be extreme and I notice it, and predictions of magnetic activity. And then I send out an analysis of my predictions and what happened the month before. So I've been doing this for quite a while now, so I'm getting more and more accurate at my predictions, far more accurate than the government. And I'd be happy to speak with you later and get some of your data and crank it into my reports. Another question.
Are you willing to reveal the healing frequencies that you found in your research?
The question is, am I willing to reveal the healing frequencies that I found in my research? And of course, I am. And first of all, there is no magic frequency. But sometimes, for some individuals, some frequencies work better than others. And the lower frequencies that work better, and I've made instruments that I can vary the frequencies, and I can test you, or anybody can test anybody else, to determine the frequencies that work best. And generally, the literature shows, and I found in my own work, that 10 to 20 cycles works. However, cycles is not the right term because we're not talking about waveforms of the school classroom type, perfect sine waves, which hardly exist in nature, but we're talking about things more variable than ocean waves, more like sound waves. So really, when I say frequency, I should say pulse repetition rate, because these come in pulses. And if you see me at the booth or I'm doing a workshop on all that, we can explore that in detail.
I have discovered lately that the solar spectrum, the yellows disappeared. Have you noticed that? I called up everybody, the solar observatories. They said, we have no data, we haven't looked at the spectrum, yet the yellow is getting narrow.
The statement was that his observation, this man's, that the solar spectrum has less yellow in it now, which is phenomenal if that's happening and would be remarkable event. I haven't seen any data on that, but one time about a year or so ago, 2 years, some psychic in Santa Cruz where I live said, watch the moon, it'll change color. And I didn't believe it, but it got a pink hue. Where's our color therapist that spoke yesterday? Maybe somebody's been sweetening it up. But I'll look for that on the sun. Got time for about one more question, I think. And I'm happy to answer them all afterwards. Oh, yes, all right.
Considering the Middle Eastern conflict now, is there a current heightened sunspot activity, sun cycle activity?
When that started, there was. Yeah, solar flare activity took a big jump. Not a huge one, but it did take a big jump. And I just plotted some of that data before coming here. But I didn't quite have it all.
Was it just before the conflict started, or was it since?
The solar activity went up just before, at the end of July, and stayed high for a while and then dropped down. And as soon as I go back, I will take a careful look at what's coming up. We're now on the downside of solar peak. We've been up since about 88. The sun's activity has been on its up, reaching this peak, cycle 22 it's called. It's been wafting around. The peak was about January of this year, and now we're starting down. It often drops down pretty fast. Now, in the war data, the battle data, peaks were usually before, 2 years before the sunspot peak, sometimes after. So we may have a bit of rockiness to go, and perhaps I ended the peace meditation work a little soon. So I'm thinking about maybe working to organize some more Middle East peace meditations in the next few months. Hope you'll join in. Okay, thanks.
Well, thank you, Burl. And now, folks,